Chemical warfare. Tactical warfare using substances such as incendiary mixtures, smoke, or gases with irritant, burning, poisonous, or asphyxiating properties. This kind of warfare has been a subject of debate for years. The physical suffering and emotional toll that it takes on those affected by it brings into question the morality of this type of warfare. In order to understand why chemical warfare is such an important subject when it comes to debate and diplomacy, let's take a look at its history. Back in 600 BC, the Athenian army used the hellebore plant to poison the water supply in the city of Kara in order to take control of it without contest. In 479 BC, Peloponnesian forces used sulfur fumes in the town of Plataea. And most notably, in 668 AD, Greek fire was invented. Greek fire was an incendiary mixture used by the Byzantine Empire. It burned even in water, which made it a formidable weapon for naval encounters. It also saved Constantinople from several Arab sieges. Moving all the way up to 1675, we see the first act of diplomacy regarding chemical warfare. The Strasbourg Agreement was a pact between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The agreement outlawed the use of poison bullets. Let's move up to the first recording of large-scale chemical weapon use, World War I.
Before we jump straight into World War I, let's look at another act of diplomacy that happened in July of 1899. The First Hague Convention was a series of international treaties and declarations that were debated at a peace conference. 51 state parties ratified these regulations that were created there. Among these regulations were the outlawing of poison and poison gases.
Fun fact, the Second Hague Convention occurred in 1907. These conventions were some of the first diplomatic attempts to solidify international law when it came to war crimes.
Unfortunately, these regulations were disregarded when World War I began. On April 22, 1915, German forces used over 150 tons of deadly chlorine gas against French soldiers in Ypres, Belgium. This was the first large-scale use of lethal weapons during the war, but it certainly wasn't the last. A few months later, on December 19th, phosgene gas was used on British soldiers just north of Ypres. In 1917, also near Ypres, the Germans released mustard gas on British and Canadian soldiers. Not all these attacks were deadly, but those that weren't caused serious psychological and physical damage to those who were affected by it.
It would be evil to research chemical weapons for the purpose of developing chemical weapons. Some of those things were discovered researching other things, and that's going to happen. That's an unforeseen consequence of certain things. But I would tell you that the research and development costs money, the application costs money, and I would say that if you were to defend yourself, you could use high-yield explosives or drones in a way today that maybe wasn't available back then, but it would accomplish the same end without means that are so immoral or in a moral gray area.
Chemical warfare during World War II is a more known subject to most people. The Nazi concentration camps used a hydrogen cyanide-based fumigant called Zyklon B to kill Jews. In the Auschwitz camp alone, up to 6,000 Jews were killed a day using this method.
For me, it was not a constant fear, but it was always kind of one of those, call it a back burner thing. It's always in the back of your mind. Always, as an NCO, non-commissioned officer, had to make sure that my guys always had that in the back of their mind as well, because some guys would leave equipment and I said, no, just at least keep it on the Stryker. Let's make sure that we're good to go. The Stryker vehicle that I was, or the platoon that I was in charge of we had NBC filters in the vehicle that would help, right? But there's nothing, if it happened, it was gonna happen. So we were prepared as good as we could be. There were numerous missions that I'm not able to speak about, but we had to be ready for that threat.
Phosgene gas, also known as carbonyl chloride, was first created and prepared in 1811. It is a mixture of chlorine and carbon monoxide gas. These two gases separate are toxic enough, but they become even more toxic when they are chemically bonded together. This deadly gas has the power to asphyxiate anyone who is unfortunate enough to breathe it in. The effects of phosgene gas are primarily felt a short while after exposure, usually an hour or two. The damage this toxin can inflict can be fatal if left untreated.
By the end of World War I, these chemicals had affected over 1.3 million people and had caused about 90,000 deaths.
A very important act of diplomacy occurred before the Vietnam War. The Geneva Convention that most people know about occurred in 1949. This convention was very similar to the Hague Convention regarding its end goals, but the Geneva Convention went deeper into the humanitarian rights of the soldiers. This included the requirement to halt and destroy the chemical weapons stockpiles of the country who signed these treaties. These countries came together all agreeing that chemical warfare is an unnecessary source of suffering for soldiers who are fighting to defend their homes.
I'd say the Geneva Convention had some, how do I put this? It's hard to make it a binary positive or negative thing, the Geneva Convention, because some positive things came of it. The people that were willing to abide by it are, of course, getting rid of their chemical weapons stockpile, and they adhere to rules in war as far as participants in war are willing to abide by them. On one other hand, though, if you have a group of people, an organization, or a nation that is willing to operate outside of those rules, you're only handcuffing those that are willing to play by the rules.
Agent Orange is an industrial herbicide that was used in the Vietnam conflict to destroy the foliage providing cover for the Viet Cong soldiers. This herbicide was used at a huge cost, though. Agent Orange contains a chemical compound classified as a dioxin. These chemicals, dioxins, are known to be carcinogenic to humans. Carcinogens are chemicals known to have the ability to cause cancer. TCCD is the most toxic dioxin compound known to man and is also the main contaminant in Agent Orange.
Now let's move on to the debate and diplomacy during the Vietnam War. On March 24, 1965, the first use of chemical warfare in Vietnam was recognized by the US government. This recognition was publicized, which caused protests to erupt all over the world. In 1966, the United Nations met to debate this action. It was argued that it ignored the protocol to prohibit the use in war of asphyxiating poisonous or other gases, and of bacteriological methods of warfare signed at the Geneva Convention, June 17, 1925. This debate ended with a resolution that emphasized the protocol that was ratified in 1925.
The first act of chemical warfare that was recognized by the U.S. government was a small portion of Operation Ranch Hand. This was the code name for the U.S. operation, which included the deployment of Agent Orange. The intention of this was to clear the trees and the foliage which were being used for guerrilla warfare against Americans. Agent Orange caused 400,000 deaths and 4.8 million Vietnamese people were exposed to it.
So, based on all of the events that we've looked at, the moral debate of chemical warfare seems pretty one-sided. Accounting for the conventions, the debates, the devastation, and the aftermath, we conclude that chemical warfare is immoral and must continue to be prohibited.
That the treaties and conventions that were meant to save people from unnecessary suffering were necessary.
That the outcome of using these weapons is proof enough that chemical weapons should be destroyed.
That the effects that these chemicals have on a person solidify the need to stop the further use of them.
The debate and diplomacy that occurred because of these weapons is a large part of our history, and the conventions that occurred helped to save lives from unnecessary suffering. Thanks for joining us. This has been Hindsight.
Chemical weapons today are an unnecessary evil. There's really no application for them that is exclusive to them unless you are doing something evil.
If it were my decision, chemical warfare would be outlawed. Like for instance in World War II and Korea, they used fire, napalm, things of that nature. It is so psychologically devastating to a person, to a human, to do that to another human. Some people never recover from things that they've done to other humans. Some people do, but it's so damaging to us as a species, as a creation of God, to have such devastation to what He has gifted us with.